insights towards developing effective decision support tools in ways that bring together evaluation, DMDU, and engagement. Thank you, Gabrielle.
Great, thank you, Catherine. So as Catherine's mentioned, I'm going to be talking about insights for developing effective decision support tools for environmental sustainability. And decision support tools are the array of computer-based tools developed to assist sound decision-making, including the management of environmental risks and planning for impacts in different sectors and regions. These types of tools can be particularly useful for managing the uncertainties and complexities in decision contexts that arise when human and environmental systems interact. Decision support tools vary in their complexity, from simple spreadsheets, complex GIS-based tools, such as this example showing Climate Central Surging Seas Risk Finder, and the amount of data they involve and in the types of models that they use. Decision support tools often enable customizable exploration of the consequences and impacts of alternative models for given decisions, such as we can see here with this example, while also considering multiple stakeholder perspectives. Although increasing complexity, the ability to customize provides stakeholders opportunity to conduct more in-depth analysis that may be more relevant for local contexts. In recent years, a greater number of decision support tools have emerged to support multi-stakeholder decision-making, from the level of individuals to communities and local to international contexts regarding environmental policies and projects. A broader look at the universe of decision support tools is available on the US Climate Resilience Toolkit's website, which posts information on over 1,000 distinct tools, ranging in focus from the built environment to ecosystems to food. There are also platforms built to organize these decision support tools and connect decision makers to the appropriate tool for their work, such as Gulftree along the US Gulf of Mexico. One of the key reasons for the increasing popularity of decision support tools is that they often facilitate dialogue and promote participation and collaboration across stakeholders, enhancing insights and supporting exploration of policy options in resource management, land use decisions, and other adaptive responses. Decision support tools provide a platform to support such deliberation with analysis, since they can be used to promote dialogue in all of the iterative stages of decision-making, including awareness, assessment, planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation through time. Despite their immense potential, decision support tools often fall short for a number of reasons. So from the perspective of the stakeholder, this may be from lack of user support, training, the amount of time they have available, access to decision support tools that may be behind a firewall, or the resources to even engage. If we take a look from the developer's perspective, they may also exhibit poor design and or execution and deployment, or they also may not be locally relevant, thus limiting their usefulness for local policymaking. Arguably, the goal of most decision support tool developers is to enhance multi-stakeholder decision analysis and participatory processes, which can take the form of structured decision-making, robust decision-making, and here we see in this figure the steps in robust decision-making analysis, and you'll hear more about that later on, or analytic deliberative processes. These processes are expected to lead to subsequent sustainability policies and projects of higher decision quality than those that did not use such approaches. Hence, it can be argued that if a decision support tool meets certain criteria or possesses certain characteristics that enhance decision quality, then it should potentially be successful. Yet, it is difficult to know exactly what a high decision quality is, as usually it is only possible to ascertain what may have been overlooked in retrospect. Indeed, there are times when a good decision can have a bad outcome, or a bad decision can have a good outcome. What can be controlled, however, is how decisions are made in the present. Thus, developers can and should take steps in the development of the decision support tools to enhance definable characteristics of decision-making. There are two separate but complementary literatures on evaluating the success of decision support tools and associated processes with the intent of improving outcomes. The first is more narrowly focused on enhancing the usability of a given tool in terms of how well that tool imparts knowledge, allows for the development of consistency in preferences, and mastery of material. And so this tends to come from a behavioral decision science approach. The second focuses more broadly on participatory processes that could involve the development and use of a decision support tool in the decision-making process. Practitioners need tools that are not only usable and participatorily developed, but that also enhance the ability to make well-informed decisions that add value to land use or resource decisions of interest. By well-informed decision-making, we mean those where stakeholders understand the costs, risks, and benefits of specific alternatives well enough to afford them the ability to make decisions in light of their preferences, values, and resources. In evaluating decision support tool success, we distilled a process and framework from existing literature and generated a list of activities that can be used to identify key characteristics of success. So here is a figure illustrating in this wheel key characteristics of success for decision support tools in order to enhance stakeholders' ability to make high quality decisions. So this involves the capacity to, one, clearly define goals. So this involves being able to describe the desired goals and the nature of the decision that needs to be made. Two, identify alternatives. And this involves being able to clarify and list possible paths of action. Three, obtain relevant information. So this involves collecting high quality decision relevant evidence. Four, articulate values. This involves being able to voice individual and collective values, views, and preferences in relation to the decision that needs to be made. Five, evaluate alternatives. So this involves weighing the alternatives in light of relevant information and articulated values. And six, monitor outcomes. This involves reviewing the decision as well as documenting those outcomes. So taking these characteristics into account in the design, development, and deployment may enhance the chances that a decision support tool is useful for the intended audience. In order to illustrate this in practice, in this particular case study evaluation that we did, we used the framework of characteristics to analyze Louisiana's Coastal Master Plan process and associated tool. In the aftermath of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005, the Louisiana legislature created the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, so I'm going to refer to this as CPRA, that coordinates efforts at the local, state, and federal level. To accomplish its mission of protection and restoration, CPRA developed a guiding master plan that is updated every 5 years and has 5 objectives for protection and restoration projects. So this is to promote flood protection and to protect and or promote natural processes, coastal habitats, cultural heritage, and the working coast. Integral in the development of the master plan is the use of the planning tool. CPRA's approach and its tools are often seen together as forming an effective decision support tool ecosystem, offering stakeholders the decision support that they need to make informed decisions. CPRA's approach and its tool are used in developing the master plan, and the master plan is developed iteratively and collaboratively with multiple government-based and community-based entities, and has received general widespread support among community members, policymakers, and planners in the region. This iterative and collaborative process further enables stakeholders to clearly define their goals. The approach taken by CPRA follows the deliberation with analysis approach, which is a key learning modality to support decision-making. In this way, quantitative analysis is used to support deliberation about policy trade-offs rather than to provide a single answer or solution. Hence, the development of the tool required a significant amount of background work, including data collection and stakeholder input. Therefore, Louisiana's coastal planning process and planning tool enables stakeholders to collaboratively identify alternatives and to obtain relevant information. The tool combines coastal condition estimates with various project attributes and effects, taking into account flood risks and ecosystem metrics over time through over 50 years. Project attribute information incorporated includes location, type, phasing, and cost. The output at this phase includes the estimated effects of potential projects for a range of social, such as social vulnerability, economic, such as navigation, traditional fishing, and ecosystem, such as land nitrogen uptake, species habitat, metrics over time and across scenarios. The tool then does a comparison, looking at cost effectiveness and the effects on coastal areas. Next, the tool identifies alternatives by maximizing key decision drivers, such as risk reduction over time and constraints such as funding or sediment availability for a specified scenario. Performance thresholds, such as other environmental health metrics or other coastal interests, can also contribute at this stage. Hence, stakeholders are enabled to further identify alternatives that balance the range of social, economic, and ecosystem metrics over time. Finally, the tool then presents visualizations and cost-effectiveness analyses, along with the effects of different scenarios. Key differences in outcomes are highlighted to assist in the decision-making process. Here is one example of how the tool shows trade-offs informed by the interests of local stakeholders. So the question here was, can shrimp habitat be improved without substantial reductions in land outcomes? So if we look at this figure here, on the x-axis we have year, and on the y-axis we have brown shrimp habitat. And I'm just going to walk us through what the various visual lines in the visualization indicates. So this visualization indicates that a portfolio of master plan projects developed to maximize land would lead to a significant decline in brown shrimp habitat. That's the orange line, as compared to the future without action. That's the gray line. Another portfolio that tries to maximize land while maintaining brown shrimp habitat is shown in brown. This portfolio would lead to larger land loss than under the maximized land case, which is not shown here. However, through iteration with the tool, CPRA identified another alternative, modified maximized land B3, that mostly maintains brown shrimp habitat, as seen in the purple line, but still leads to most of the land building gains. Moreover, previous analyses, not shown here, found that the modified maximized land B3 only led to a small reduction in land loss compared to maximized land. Therefore, CPRA decided from these visualizations that no further adjustment was needed for this alternative. Visualizations such as these would be used during stakeholder meetings to support deliberations about what projects should be included in the master plan. Thus, this coastal planning process and planning tool ecosystem enables stakeholders to articulate values and evaluate alternatives. So in sum, we are seeing a rise in the number of decision support tools for sustainability decision-making. And we have presented the case here that perhaps they should be developed with the goal of enhancing decision quality to increase overall usefulness of the tools for stakeholders. And through our review of the literature, what we've distilled are key characteristics of successful tools that enable stakeholders to clearly define goals, identify alternatives, obtain relevant information, articulate values, evaluate alternatives, and monitor outcomes. So thank you so much for your attention. I'll take any questions.
Perfect. And we've got time for a question or two. And I think people can either just talk directly or put your questions into the chat.
Do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
Up to you. Maybe I guess I can throw out a question while we're waiting for the next question. So as you think about, evaluation of decision support tools for very, very tailored, specific contexts of DMDU engagement, as might be the case for most climate change adaptation, say, how do you see the needs for evaluating the effectiveness of those tools in specific stakeholder contexts as compared to some of the tools like the Climate Central Surging Seas tool that you started with that really are accessible much more broadly? I think some of the tensions of different perspectives would come into play in different ways.
I think that's a really good point. I think for tools that are available more broadly, I think something like Climate Central Surging Seas Risk Finder is perhaps a tool for planning, and there's been some talk about coupling that tool with other tools that people use at the point that they're making a decision. So for example, coupling it with Zillow or other real estate search websites so that when people are making decisions about where to purchase a home, they're taking that risk into account. But those types of tools ostensibly are also for increasing dialogue and conversation around these risks. So it's not for a decision per se, but rather just to kind of have something to talk about. In terms of evaluating for specific stakeholders and specific contexts, I think it's always valuable. But I think there are constraints from both the perspectives of the stakeholders, but also the perspective of the researchers. That type of evaluation can take a lot of time and resources that may not be accounted for, just may not be at hand. So, some developers just may not have that luxury. But I think that if one is able to evaluate, I would imagine that evaluation in terms of seeking higher quality decisions would be, could help the process.
Super. See if there's one more quick question, and then otherwise we will switch on to the next presentation.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
It's two questions. So I'm interested in whether you thought about the level of proficiency or skill in the decision makers, especially under conditions of uncertainty, and what models of decision making you considered being used under uncertainty as opposed to the models that are used generally in day-to-day life.
So with respect to your first questions, the proficiency of the decision makers in terms of their ability to understand the output?
Their ability to make decisions in uncertainty, in conditions of uncertainty.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it depends on the decision makers we're talking about. So if we're talking about decisions in terms of developing sustainability projects, I suppose that I agree. I think that could matter in terms of being able to make decisions under uncertainty versus kind of on a day-to-day basis. But we also know, at least from the behavioral decision sciences, that training or kind of more information about how to understand that information and kind of the limitations of making those types of decisions and the models that underlie them and the uncertainties in them, the more that people know and are able to use that information, the better they're going to be able to make those types of decisions. So I think that proficiency can be a limitation, but I also see it as an opportunity where people can be trained, and perhaps that could be a part of the process. And I think that kind of touched on your second question, but I'm sure I fully answered it. But I also know that we are running short on time. So I also, a polls exam. If there are any other questions, please shoot me an email.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And in the interest of time, since I know you've got a next engagement and we have 2 more presentations to go, we will now shift over to Rob Lemper and Sarah Turner, who will be talking about engaging multiple worldviews with quantitative decision support. Rob, over to you.
Great. You can hear me? Can you hear me?
There.
Great. Okay, great. Good. So this work started out thinking about evaluation and improving stakeholder processes and took a long detour into tool building. So I'm going to talk about that and head back to what might be evaluated at the end. And then Sarah, who's online, and I were the leads on this work. Now I've got to get there we go. Yeah, that's advanced. Okay, great. So, you know, hard to ignore that we live in a world where there's lots of disagreement about public policy issues, you know, fundamental disagreement, not just on choices, but on ends and means and on how to frame the problem, this sort of wicked problem idea. You know, a lot of agreement that a propensity and an ability to consider the multiple worldviews, see the world from other people's point of views is an important ingredient helping address these problems. Multi-objective, multi-scenario DMDU would seem to be a good starting point for trying to get at these challenges. And there's actually been a lot of work in that area over the last couple of years. And so we are adding to that with what we think is, you know, sort of important step forward, which is very much considering multiple worldviews as an enduring feature of the problem formulation and the way you handle the analytics, and fundamentally are going to be doing multiple parallel analyses from different worldviews and then trying to compare and combine them. We are using here, there we go, this lake model or lake challenge, which is sort of ubiquitous as a sort of a starting point for development of ideas in the DMDU literature. Town on the shore of a pristine lake, proposed economic development. It may pollute the lake, improve welfare for some people, decrease it for others. Deep uncertainties, including the tipping points of the lake. What level of pollution does it shift to a green and smelly state? To what extent can you decouple development from pollution? How effective are different policies? What strategy should the town pursue? The thing that we're adding here is this idea of looking at different worldviews. Here's a sort of a classic definition of a worldview, but a comprehensive conception of the world comprising a correlated set, correlation's important, values, beliefs, policy preferences, shape how one understands, judges, and acts in the world. And there's a paper, recent paper in risk analysis by Sarah and I that this talk draws from. Okay, so what we're essentially going to do here is take the standard RDM approach and conduct separate RDM analyses in parallel, which are then compare and couple them together to try to get at this idea of people seeing the world through fundamentally different worldviews, and then trying to get them to see the world from different points of view and see if there aren't any compromise policies. Oops, okay. We did this work explicitly intending to be able to inform deliberation with analysis of the type that Gabrielle was talking about. And in addition, patterned after some work which exists, we did not do, but exists, where using mixed social science mixed methods, anthropological methods, surveys, focus groups, interviews, text analysis, people took communities dealing with decisions under deep uncertainty and pulled out of that different worldviews. And so we very much patterned this analysis, assuming that one would have done that at the front end. Okay, so we worked with a, here are the worldviews we looked at, and we looked at within a plural rationalities, cultural theories, a risk framework. Some people love this framework, some people hate it. We found it very useful here for a variety of reasons, but sort of the fundamental points here don't depend on this framework, but we think this was useful to look at it. So the groups are hierarchists, egalitarians, individualists. They have fundamentally different questions they ask about the situation. The hierarchists are interested, what's the best balance between environmental protection and economic growth? The egalitarians want to protect what is, and that's, you know, their main focus. And the individualists are interested in opportunity for everybody, sort of irrespective of how that's allocated across different groups, sort of classic utilitarian. They have different mental models in their heads with these classic, you know, pictorial diagrams of resilience or lack thereof. The hierarchists tend to see the lake and the economy as both resilient. The egalitarians, the economy is resilient, the lake less so. Inverse for the individualists. They have different goals that they're interested in, and then different views of what are acceptable means to pursue policy ends. So a classic thing one does in BMD analysis is do a problem framing using this XLRM framework: uncertainties, policy levers, relationships, measures. So in this analysis, everybody uses the same structure of the model. And this is the classic lake model, that we've augmented it in two ways. One, there are two economic sectors with two distinct populations that serve them, and traditional economy, new economy, which is obviously meant to be sort of a wild abstraction of the some of the fundamental rifts in our society right now. And then we make policy as controllers in a control theory sense, which are observe things and adjust as they go along if one is into that sort of policy. Then we have our measures, levers, and uncertainties. Not to go into these great detail, but there's environmental and economic measures. There's a whole bunch of them. The different worldviews care about different measures. So the individualists really just care only about a roll-up environmental measure and the size of the economy, none of the unemployment or inequality measures. The hierarchists and egalitarians care about a lot more of the different individual measures. And then importantly, some of the groups care about trade-offs, meaning that they're willing to take a little bit more of one thing if they, you know, for a little bit less of another. And others, particularly egalitarians, are really just interested in constraints. They have sort of absolute conditions. It can't be less than this, can't be more than that. Their policy levers, essentially pollution regulation and job training. And the fundamental difference there is that some of the worldviews are accepting of a more technocratic, if you want to call it that, adaptive policy, and others just want strict, known, invariant rules. And then there's uncertainties like the environment, socioeconomic, and policy parameters, you know, and just that those are organized so that this model has very tippy behavior in that it can do easily head-off and transformations, which are good or bad. A good one is you get a total decoupling of economic activity from pollution in a good scenario. In a bad scenario, one or both of the economic sectors can collapse. Okay, this is the one complicated slide I'm going to show you. We start in each worldview, and then we come up with acceptable policy choices. We take the multi-objective robust optimization tools that Pat Reed talked about this morning or earlier in this session. And we come up with a set of Pareto-optimal trade-offs, you know, acceptable strategies for each worldview. This is for the hierarchists. The strategy here have regulations which adjust themselves based on observed pollution levels and any warning signs of the lake turning green. And training adjusts on unemployment levels. The equations are down there in the bottom if you're interested. And over on the left are all the acceptable solutions that we could find here. Essentially three clusters: one that pay a lot of attention to warning, some that pay a lot of attention to the level of pollution and adjust regulations based on that, and others which are sort of balanced between the two, and they pretty much all have the same level of training and pretty much all have the same target level of pollution. These strategies generate a range of trade-offs among the outcomes. This is the Pareto surface. This is a three-dimensional, the colors are one dimension, showing economic size of the economy, inequality, and environmental impact. And so for the purposes of comparing the hierarchists to the others, we pick a representative strategy right at the knee of the curve there. And this is one that has moderate regulation and warning, and has relatively high economic growth, relatively low inequality, and sort of a middling level of pollution. Okay, so now we want to compare different strategies. And so here, or different worldviews. And so here we use this device of the utopia-dystopia matrix, which is basically the idea if you take a strategy that's well aligned with the world, you get a happy outcome. And if you take a strategy which is misaligned with the world you're actually in, you can get a bad outcome. So we're going to ask, and we're going to measure, goodness and badness for each objective with a regret measure, which is essentially the distance of a strategy in one worldview from the closest point on the Pareto surface of another worldview. And then kind of backup slide if you want to see how we do that. But essentially it's, if I'm in one worldview, how far away am I from the best I could do in the other worldview? And you can ask this question in a couple of different ways. And one is, how would I assess my favorite strategy if the world unfolds according to your worldview? And so we have strategy worldview. So it's a hierarchist and a hierarchist. It's all green. So that's the utopia line. For the if you have a hierarchist strategy, I like a hierarchist strategy, but viewed from a egalitarian worldview, it does really poorly on environment and unemployment, does a little bit better on economy. If I take my hierarchist strategy and it's seen from your individualist worldview, it does okay on environment, does okay on unemployment and inequality, doesn't do so well on economy. We can ask this there, and this are the other patterns here. And so we see by and large, the strategies for in one worldview don't do well in the other. The other thing you notice here is that there's different columns, which is because different worldviews care about different things. We can ask this question, a related question, how would you assess my favorite strategy according to your worldview? So you're sitting here and you take my strategy and see how it works. We run through that, notice that there are different objectives that we're looking at. And the patterns are roughly the same, though not identical. But the fundamental point is that none of these strategies work across worldviews. Pretty much each worldview has a strategy which only works in its worldview and doesn't look so good from anybody else's. So can we find compromise strategies? So one would envision going through some sort of iterative learning engagement process, this deliberation with analysis process Gabrielle talked about, Pat talked about earlier today. And so our guess here was, well, maybe we should have a different sort of strategy, one that has a constant regulation level until the pollution intensity falls below some threshold. In other words, so you can demonstrate sort of this technocratic success, and then you go down. And the notion, guess was here, which again, we didn't have a real stakeholder process, so we can test it, that the egalitarians might put up with this sort of strategy. We can conduct some scenario discovery to see if strategies of this form can work across worldviews. What we found, and the equation and the picture are down in the bottom, you can do that in the questions if people are interested, but essentially we could find strategies of this form that worked for two pairs of worldviews, but not across all three. So we could find ones that work for egalitarians and hierarchists, and one that worked for individualists and hierarchists, but we couldn't find one that worked for all three. And now we can go back to the utopia-dystopia matrix. And so old ones are on the left, the new one for the compromise strategies are on the right. The colored lines show the ones that we're lining up. And by and large, the compromise strategies work a lot better than the individual ones. By and large, they do pretty well across most, but not all of the measures. And the speckled red are ones where the percentage is really big, but actually the base was small, so all the numbers are small. So we at least went some steps towards being able to find strategies that worked, potential compromise strategies that look good from different worldviews reflected back on the others. To find one that seemed to work for all groups, one would need to either come up with some combination of much better strategy, framing, or getting some of the groups to relax some of their goals. And so that would obviously require dealing with real stakeholders to do that. So claim here is that we've helped to advance decision support for wicked problems. The key idea here is that we do the analysis in parallel for different worldviews, have ways to kind of instantiate different worldviews in the analysis setup, and then have ways to compare compare across those worldviews. Have a number of methods for doing that. Obviously this requires some field testing. Sarah and I have some work going on in the climate space. We're trying to do this for some real problems, but obviously it'd be interesting to try it in others. And basically taking the whole thing front to back and then testing along the lines that Gabrielle laid out to see whether it accomplished some of the goals of the deliberative process. So thanks, and questions.
Thank you, Rob. And let's hold questions until the end so that we can do questions for you and Alison together, since both of you can stay until the end. So we'll shift now to Alison Meadow, who's an expert in evaluation, and we'll be discussing some of the available evaluation frameworks and tools that might be particularly of interest for evaluating DMDU engagement.
Hi, everyone. Well, first, I just want to thank Catherine and Rob for inviting me to participate in this panel. This has been a great and wonderful learning experience for me. This is a bit of a new area for me, so I've really enjoyed learning from all of you. I am at the University of Arizona in something called the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. I focus mostly on evaluating the societal impacts of climate and environmental research. I also work with communities who are entering the space of climate adaptation planning, making sure that the science that they're getting fits their needs. So kind of have a foot in both worlds of the practice and the evaluation. And I need to identify myself, I think, as a qualitative researcher. I'm really firmly rooted in qualitative methods and participatory processes. So that's really the perspective that I brought to this when Sarah and Rob invited me to participate. Okay, I'm going to start out with this because I do a lot of evaluation work. I'm used to people getting their backs up a little bit about evaluation. So I like to start with this slide to kind of break the ice. We can get past the UG factor in evaluation. I thought there was a comment in the previous session about when we grade people in evaluation, we often disincentivize them learning and growth. And I just really appreciated that comment because that is exactly the philosophy that I like to bring to evaluation. Evaluation should be about learning and growth potential. So I'm gonna bring that perspective as well. Okay, why should we evaluate DMDU or really anything at all? The goal of DMDU or any of our adaptation processes really is to solve problems. We want to help people make better decisions and through those decisions improve our futures. When we work with any planning, decision-making, science to action process, it's really not enough to assume that our processes work. And I think I think we're all on the same page there. We really need to evaluate to see if our processes are working, if they're getting us the outcomes that we're looking for. So that requires us really to both have action and to then have really rigorous reflection on that action. And that's kind of my definition of evaluation, is that process of rigorous reflection. There's really kind of multiple ways to view evaluation from this very basic evaluation of worth or measure. Does this have value? If so, how much? We can move into that sort of grading definition of evaluation for accountability. Did you do what you said you were going to do? Did you achieve what you said you were going to achieve? Evaluation for learning, which is that observe, reflect, plan, that really nice process where we're saying, what can we take from this? And in in that process, in that learning, then we also help us move to this sort of higher level of evaluation for democracy. Are our social structures working? For whom? So that's a way to sort of tie those two together. So I really like to focus, oh, I'm sorry, my screen, oh, there we go. Evaluation for learning. When we really look at our processes and our practices and strengthen those, then particularly in the realm of climate adaptation planning, environmental planning, we also then help to inform that process of our democracy and strengthening our social systems. Rob, I was really struck by something that you touched on in your recent chapter on robust decision making, about Amartya Sen's concept of relational reasoning, excuse me. And it just really resonated with me. So in the spirit of using evaluation for learning to contribute to evaluation for democracy, I just wanted to touch upon this idea of relational reasoning. The idea, and he juxtaposes it with transcendental reasoning, in which we assume that there's a vision of a perfect world out there and that we should all move towards that perfect world. Or relational reasoning says that there's a diversity of priorities and goals and values, and that this is really a fundamental attribute of our world, and we really kind of have to embrace that. But we can work on our process and embrace that diversity in our process and help us move toward justice through this embrace of diversity. So I think we can use this evaluation mindset in our evaluation tools, first to understand what our definition of justice is, whether during our process we're moving, and then whether that movement is towards this justice. So I just wanted to use that as a little bit of a jumping off point when I start to think about participation in these decision-making processes. So I'm going to just really briefly introduce two evaluation approaches that struck me as something that could help to inform some of the decision-making under deep uncertainty or any of our adaptation planning processes. These kind of, we can look at sort of short-term and long-term outcomes in all of our processes and where we're going, what we're doing right now and where that gets us to in the long term. So just before I talk about these two, really quick bit of jargon within the field of evaluation. We often use these terms process and outcome evaluation, or you might have heard formative and summative. Process evaluation or formative evaluation means we're looking at the things that are done, who's involved, what activities are taking place, and how people perceive those activities. And then our outcome, impact, or summative evaluation refers to evaluating the success of a project or program as compared to either an externally defined measure or an internally defined goal. So I'm going to talk about these two evaluation approaches, developmental evaluation and societal impacts evaluation. Both of these could be used for process or outcome evaluation. I'm going to just frame them a little bit as developmental evaluation having, I think, some particular strengths in process, and societal impacts as particular strengths in outcome or impact evaluation, but I think they can both inform both. So that's my, not to scale, just wanted to frame that a little bit. There we go. So developmental evaluation is an approach that was pioneered by Michael Quinn Patton explicitly for use in the context of complexity and uncertainty. It's meant to be used as an iterative process that moves a project or program toward innovation and greater certainty over time. We can use this when we need feedback on major system changes that are unexpected, a rapid response to sudden change, when uncertainty is high, or when innovation, in other words, an unknown goal is unknown future is our goal. Developmental evaluation asks all participants to really actively engage in an ongoing assessment and reflection on the process that they're engaged in. You want to have discussions about who is involved, what the group knows, what's been happening, how activities have affected outcomes. The ultimate goal is to use those structured reflections to reveal a path forward, and really importantly, how the group got to this path, so that you know how that might be replicated or adapted in the future. If you can't figure out how you got to where you're going, it's harder to do it again. So some really key questions I think developmental evaluation can bring to DMDU. And again, this is really focused on that participation process and who's at the table. I think it can really help with understanding those priorities and weights, the values questions. Do we have all the affected stakeholders represented in the process? Who's missing? Doing that sort of periodically to make sure that we have all the bases covered. The next step in that one is, are we hearing and listening to all the voices? And this gets down to your participation process. It's not enough to have everybody seated at the table if we're not consistently hearing from everybody. Are there common grounds in terms of priorities and weights? And do we understand why we might have splits in those preferences or those values? Because that can help us negotiate finding those common grounds. In terms of changes in certainty, we can be checking in with our participants regularly. Has anything changed in terms of what we know as the process has gone on? Have those changes affected how people are feeling about values, priorities, and weights? Do new participants bring new knowledge about system components that then can sort of ripple through the system that way? So that's that iterative process. This requires, this ongoing, like, let's check in what's going on periodically through the process. Okay, shifting gears. Societal impacts evaluation is an approach that can elucidate what we're changing in the world or in the system of interest. And gives us feedback about the extent to which it was pioneered really for understanding how research is affecting the world outside of academia, but I think it's got broader uses. So it's whether research is having a positive or negative impact in society outside of academia. We can use it particularly when we need near-term feedback on changes that are emerging from a DMDU or from a research process. Evidence of really large-scale changes, things like increasing resilience, or whether a place is more adaptable, has adapted to climate change, can really take years to observe. So, societal impacts evaluation uses impact indicators that have been linked to increased likelihood of larger system-wide changes. So it gives us that more immediate feedback. Are we on the right path? Are we seeing some changes? The key question here is what has changed and for whom. And we use it by collecting evidence from participants in the process. We look at the media, we look at documents, particularly management documents, plans and policies, and we can assess in that way what's going on, what has changed, what has this process contributed to. So there's kind of consensus emerging around a group of categories that we can use to talk about our societal impacts. I don't love the category names, but I see real value in us kind of starting to use a common framework. So I'm leaving our category names. I think they could be a lot more descriptive, but they range from instrumental impacts, where we can see tangible evidence that our process has contributed to changes in plans, decisions, practices, and policies. This might be evidenced in a management document, a new plan, changes in budget allocation, those kinds of things. Conceptual impacts often are required before we get to those instrumental. So that's that sort of near-term feedback. Are we seeing changes in people's knowledge about or awareness of an issue? Several other of those categories: capacity building. I think we've heard talk about that a little bit before. Is the process helping build capacity in the organization or the system of interest? Enduring connectivity. Are we seeing relationships and networks build? Because that is often a precursor to these larger scale changes. In the research context in particular, we talk about attitude or culture change for the researcher, getting more comfortable with a participatory process, with integrating other worldviews, for example, into their analysis. That can be a nice marker of change. Evidence examples can again range from very formal evaluations through randomized control trials to the kinds of more informal but still relevant evaluation that a researcher or could do on their own, collecting informal correspondence from their participants, some self-reflection, doing some searches to find out where their research has maybe ended up in management documents. No one piece of evidence is proof of impact. Obviously, you need multiple sources to really understand what's been going on. So kind of the summary, these two approaches, developmental evaluation can help us understand how the process affects the outcome, and for the participants who's been involved and how they've been affected by this. Societal impacts evaluation really help us understand how our work is contributing to change and for whom. And a really important part of all of this is building long-term and ongoing evaluation into our adaptation work, because that can allow us to learn from our experiences, course correct in real time if we need to, and then effectively apply those lessons to current and future efforts. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Allison. A really wonderful summary. And I received a question of whether your slides would be available, and the same thing was going through my mind. So we've got a few moments for questions for both Allison, Rob, as well as Sarah. We can just open it up. There was one question that came through on the chat that was a little bit of a joke, but I think there's a serious heart there, so maybe I'll just kick it off with that one, which was really kind of, what do you do in handling different worldviews if a worldview involves a capacity to create an alternative reality? And that came through from someone who's a philosopher. But I think there's a pretty deep question there about, in all of this space of evaluation and worldviews, what do we do about the issues of trust that we're grappling with? Allison, you had democracy listed in the space of evaluation. Something at the nexus there. Is there anything you want to reflect on of kind of where these methods are pushed to the max in some ways in our current context of using DMDU?
Well, let's see. I often use the metaphor when I'm talking about this, and this comes from my qualitative background. It's a ground game. I just rely very much on the relationship building, and that kind of goes back to that enduring connectivity impact, that if we can, if we have the opportunity, if we are able to take the time and do the work of finding common ground through developing some mutual respect, even when that is incredibly hard, we may then be able to make those bigger leaps to these bigger, more complicated decisions. A quote that's really been resonating with me recently is the idea that just because it's not scalable doesn't mean it's not worth doing. I think we need both. We need the big scalable efforts, but some of those need to be still rooted in the very hard and honestly like labor intensive and emotionally intensive work of just sitting with people, hearing their concerns, hearing where they're coming from, and seeing where we are able to find some common ground.
Yeah, I just say there's actually at least three really profound questions in Casey's question comment. I mean, one is a question of where do you draw the boundaries of, plausible mental models that you would actually include in this sort of analysis, and what counts as plausible and what not. There's another of the trust issue, and I think in what we laid out, and in much of this, there's a sort of an implicit assumption that if you can make an honest attempt to understand how someone sees the world, that even if it's very different than the way you see the world, that that would in a suitable engagement process help build trust so that you could then actually talk to one another. And then number three is that, which is related to, who's at the table and who actually participates, is, that some sort of that people are actually interested and willing, and at some level find it valuable to spend the time engaged in this sort of activity. And there's actually 4 categories in the cultural theory of risk, which often get left out in these sorts of analysis, which are the fatalists, who are the ones that have the people who really don't believe you can do anything about anything, and so actually have very little interest in participating in this sort of endeavor at all, and they're just hard to include in any in any useful way in this sort of analysis. And so what do you do about, how do you reach people like that? And maybe it's through trusted agents or whatever. But anyway, yeah, so at least 3 really important questions in Casey's not really so tongue-in-cheek question.
I think
Yeah,
one
great.
additional thing I would add really fast is to some extent, it also requires thinking about what our role is as practitioners and as model developers. So what are we doing with the models in the context of this participatory process? And so in work that Rob and I have been playing with, if you have one of these groups, to what extent is the model meant to reflect reality, which is sort of traditionally how I view the role of the quantitative piece, versus creating discursive space to represent somebody else's worldview, right? So if the model is representing a model in somebody's head, I'm doing something different as a practitioner than if I'm trying to reflect the world as it is.
Yeah.
I just have a question with these different world views and different participants and people who don't want to participate. It's what's happening in the United States right now. And I'm wondering if we have anything to contribute to making it work. What's going on in the United States right now?
Yes, I mean, and obviously this sort of, the way we set up this analysis was a stylized representation of the some of the divides in the society. And I mean, the implicit assumption would be that one could take some issue and try to, use this, use the sort of dystopia matrix idea as a way to help people talk to one another. So yeah, I mean, that's the idea. One would have to give it a try, right?
How do you get them to talk to each other?
I mean, there are groups that do that. I mean, there's actually a proliferation of groups that try to get people to talk to one another. And, I mean, they actually seem to get some traction. I mean, it involves working through trusted sources, actually listening and so forth. And, and there's questions about, how, what people agree, what people take away from those processes once they go back into the world that they're in and so forth. But implicit in this is the idea that, maybe we need some, need to make some sort of, significant changes to get the society to work better. And you need negotiate, spaces to discuss that. And to the extent that quantitative analysis is useful in thinking about them, which it often is, problems that involve, environmental and economic and related things, that configuring tools in this sort of way might be a useful approach in those sorts of things. But obviously, you need to do a lot of the work of finding people who are willing to sit in the same room with each other. But again, I mean, there are lots of examples of those things out there.
Well, what I've been watching on television lately, I can't see them sitting in the same room together.
Cable news is probably not a good place to start.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's
It would be nice if DMDU could make a contribution to what's going on. It really would.
Yeah.
Go to Jim, who's got a question. I know we're over time, but we'll just take at least one more question to close this out.
So it's a bit of a comment rather than a question, but I'll try and frame it like a question. So one of the things I'm really interested in is less about kind of the process and more about the end goal is about the decision maker and getting decision makers to make better choices. And I'd really like your stuff. That was really cool to try and look at how, and it makes me. I put something in the post about how it reminds me of the kind of the work that Walter Sinan Armstrong's done about how people think and argue, and actually there's quite a skill, and it links to Warren's point, is that I think there's quite a skill in being able to reflect on other people's opinions that are very different from yours and learning from it, and it's not something that we as a kind of society, I think as a whole modern society does particularly well, and that's part of my point is that do you think in order for DMDU to land, actually one of the things that's missing is having enough people with the skill to be able to understand and reason effectively to then be able to use these processes and tools well enough, which is one of the things that I talked about, I think, in 2018.
Yeah.
So that was more of a comment rather than a question, but if you can answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think this reflects, actually on a number of things that we've heard today. At the opening session, Alejandro was, I think, talking about, how do you take these concepts and make them, easily explainable, or at least, sort of worth the effort for people making decisions, which I think is a, important and central question. To some extent, I see that in the resilience metrics that Stefan Haugot was talking about in the session just before this, where essentially they're trying to, mainstream the idea of checking to see where your plan breaks as a part of the approval process, and trying to find a way to socialize that within the organization, so that he didn't quite say it this way, but that if you haven't identified where your plan might break, then you're not doing your job. And is there a way to kind of make the finding where your plan breaks and sufficiently sufficiently something that you can do in order to so that the expectation you're doing. So yeah, so I mean, you're trying to turn. I mean, the example I always like to use is, benefit cost analysis, right? I mean, there's a whole, field, and people do it in very complicated ways, but sort of the basic idea that, if you're going to do something, the benefits ought to be bigger than the costs is a pretty mainstreamed and understandable idea. And, are there a couple of ideas that, that can be mainstreamed like that, be made common, that then obviously there's a whole bunch of complicated stuff that one can do if you follow that seriously, but that becomes sort of the sort of the basic discourse in COIN, right? Oh yeah, that's the way you ought to frame this up.
Just to add a quick point to that, so we had a little success in the UK Ministry of Defence in that we got some of our senior decision makers to use regret as one of their measures when they were making some assessments recently. So we're kind of taking baby steps to hopefully get there.
Neat.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Rob and Sarah, to Allison and Gabrielle, and for all of you for listening in and sending questions. I suspect any of the speakers would be happy to hear from you after the fact by email, and we look forward to continuing the conversations.
Thanks all, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.